The door slammed so hard that the old photo frame above it tilted, then crashed to the floor, glass shattering like a gunshot in my chest. For a second, I thought someone had broken in. I was still holding a wet teacup, steam rising, when my son's wife stood in my living room, her eyes sharp, her lips twisted with a confidence that didn't belong there. She didn't greet me. She didn't even look surprised to see me. She just pointed a finger at my face and said, "Stop controlling my husband, otherwise don't blame me for what happens next." In that moment, something ancient and fragile inside me cracked. This was my house. The house I had paid for with 30 years of factory work, night shifts, and aching bones. The house where my son took his first steps, where I sold my wedding bangles to pay his school fees, where I sat awake through his fevers and failures. And now I was standing barefoot on my own floor, being threatened like a stranger. My son stood behind her, silent. That silence hurt more than her words. I tried to speak, but my throat felt stuffed with cotton. My hands trembled as I placed the teacup on the table, spilling brown stains across the cloth I had washed that morning. "Beta," I said softly, looking at my son. "What is this? What have I done?" She laughed, not loud, worse, cold. "See," she snapped at him, "this drama, this emotional blackmail, always acting weak so you feel guilty." My son looked down. He didn't defend me. He didn't even meet my eyes. Pain has a strange way of traveling through the body. It doesn't just stay in the heart. It crawls into your back, your knees, your breath. I felt it everywhere as she walked deeper into my home, inspecting my furniture like an enemy territory. She picked up a framed photo of my late husband, sneered, and put it down face first. "You call him 10 times a day," she continued. "You ask where he is, what he ate, why he's late. He is my husband now, not your little boy." Each word landed like a slap. I wanted to scream that I called because he used to call me, that I asked because he once shared everything with me. That love was not control. But my voice betrayed me. Years of being told to adjust, to stay quiet, to not create drama wrapped around my tongue like chains. Neighbors began to gather. I could hear murmurs outside, sandals scraping, curtains shifting. She raised her voice on purpose. "If you don't stop interfering," she said loudly, "we will cut you off completely. No visits, no calls. You will die alone in this house." Public humiliation burns differently. It's not just pain, it's exposure. I felt stripped, judged, reduced to a stereotype, an old, controlling mother-in-law. No one asked my side. No one remembered the sacrifices. They only saw her confidence and my shaking hands. I searched my son's face one last time, hopping for a flicker of the boy who once hid behind my dupatta when he was scared. Instead, he whispered, "Amy, please, don't make this harder." Harder? As if my heart wasn't already collapsing. They left the way they came, loud, victorious. The door slammed again. This time, nothing broke on the wall. Something broke inside me instead. I sank onto the floor beside the shattered glass, surrounded by silence, holding a photograph of a life where love had once meant loyalty. That was the day I learned pain doesn't always scream. Sometimes, it just sits with you, quietly, and waits. Did not sleep that night. I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the walls of my house breathe, every creak sounding like a whisper accusing me of some crime I did not understand. By morning, the humiliation had already begun to grow legs. It always does. Pain stays inside, but humiliation walks outside and introduces itself to everyone. When I stepped out to sweep the front of my house, I felt eyes before I heard voices. The same neighbors who had gathered the night before now stood in small groups, pretending to be busy. As soon as the broom touched the ground, whispers followed. Not subtle, not kind. "That's her," someone murmured. "The mother-in-law," another replied. I heard she doesn't let her son live peacefully. Each word was like dirt thrown gently, but repeatedly, until you realize you are buried. I kept my head down, sweeping slowly, as if cleanliness could restore dignity. But dignity is fragile when stories are told without you. By noon, my phone started ringing. Relatives, distant cousins who had never once asked if I was eating properly. Now they called with advice disguised as concern. "Why are you interfering? Children need freedom these days." You should adjust. After all, she is his wife. Adjust, that word again, as if love was a stain I should scrub away. In the afternoon, I went to the market. I needed vegetables, but what I got was judgment. The shopkeeper, who used to greet me with respect, asked casually, "Your son doesn't live with you anymore, right?" I nodded. He smiled knowingly. "Better this way. Young people need space." Space? They spoke as if I was occupying too much air. The worst moment came unexpectedly. I was standing near the bus stop when I heard her voice behind me, sharp, confident, familiar. My son's wife stood there with two women I recognized from the neighborhood. She did not lower her voice. She wanted me to hear. "Some mothers don't know when to let go," she said, glancing at me sideways. "They emotionally trap their sons, then they act innocent." The women nodded, enjoying the drama like afternoon tea. I froze. My body wanted to turn to defend itself, to shout that I had never trapped anyone, that I had only loved, but my legs refused. My mouth stayed closed. Silence wrapped around me like shame. She smirked when she saw I wouldn't react. Victory looks loud when the other person stays quiet. When I reached home, my chest felt heavy, as if someone had stacked bricks inside it. I sat on the sofa and stared at the wall where my son's graduation photo used to hang. I had taken it down that morning, not because I stopped loving him, but because looking at it felt like being laughed at by my own memories. By evening, the calls stopped. The whispers had already done their work. I was labeled controlling, toxic, old-fashioned, dangerous. No one knocked to ask if I was okay. No one wondered how a mother could suddenly become a villain without a single question. That night, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. The woman staring back at me looked smaller than before, older, tired, but behind her eyes, something new flickered, not anger, not revenge. Awareness. I realized humiliation had stripped me of my voice in public, but it had given me clarity in private. I could continue begging for understanding, or I could step back and watch the truth reveal itself on its own time. For the first time since the door slammed in my face, I did not cry. I simply closed the curtains, locked the door, and chose silence, not as weakness but as shelter. Silence did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, like dust settling after a storm. At first, it felt unnatural. My hands reached for the phone without thinking, my fingers hovering over my son's name before stopping, trembling, as if the screen itself had learned to reject me. I put the phone face down and walked away. That small act felt heavier than any argument I had ever lost. Days passed, then weeks. I stopped calling. I stopped asking neighbors about them. When relatives brought his name into conversations, I nodded politely and changed the subject. Some mistook my quiet for acceptance. Others saw it as defeat. Let them. Silence is often misunderstood by people who confuse noise with strength. Inside the house, life became slower. I ate simple meals. I prayed longer. At night, when loneliness pressed against my chest, I let it sit there without fighting it. Pain demands attention, but silence teaches endurance. I was learning how to live without expecting kindness from the people I had given everything to. One afternoon, my son finally called. I watched the phone ring until it stopped. That moment was terrifying, not because I didn't want to hear his voice, but because I did, and still chose not to answer. My heart pounded as if I had committed a crime. A mother ignoring her child goes against everything society teaches you, but something deeper told me that if I answered, I would be pulled back into a place where my worth depended on my ability to apologize for existing. He didn't call again for a long time. News still reached me, like echoes through walls. I heard they were struggling with money. I heard arguments were becoming frequent. I heard her temper was no longer reserved just for me. People love sharing other people's storms, especially when they once blamed you for the rain. I said nothing. I focused on myself in small, quiet ways. I fixed the leaking tap on my own. I rearranged the furniture not to fill space, but to remind myself that I still had control over something. I even took out old documents, bank papers, property files, things I had ignored for years because my life had revolved around my son. I organized them neatly, without knowing why. Perhaps some part of me was preparing. Then one evening, there was a knock on the door. For a second, my heart jumped, expecting trouble. But it was just a neighbor, her voice softer than before. "I heard you've been unwell," she said, not meeting my eyes. I smiled politely. I had not been unwell. I had been invisible. There is a difference. More time passed. Festivals came and went. No visits, no greetings. I cooked less. I spoke less. But strangely, I felt more solid, as if silence was pressing me into a shape that could no longer be bent easily. Late one night, I sat on the floor with my husband's old diary in my lap. I had not opened it since he passed away. Inside were notes about savings, about the house, about the future. One line caught my attention. "Never give everything at once. Even love needs boundaries." I closed the diary and breathed deeply. That was when I understood that silence was not emptiness. It was observation. It was patience. While everyone believed I had been pushed aside, I was quietly stepping back, watching patterns form, watching truths reveal themselves without my interference. And in that stillness, something shifted. I was no longer waiting to be chosen. I was preparing to choose. The shift didn't announce itself with drama. There was no sudden confidence, no loud realization. Power rarely arrives with noise. It comes quietly, the moment you stop needing permission to breathe. It began with a letter from the bank. I remember holding the envelope in my hands, the paper thin but heavy with meaning. It was a routine notice about an old fixed deposit, one I had opened years ago, quietly, when my husband was still alive. Money I had never mentioned. Money I had never needed to explain. As I read it, I realized how much of my life I had spent making myself financially transparent for the comfort of others, as if security was something I had to justify. I didn't call my son. I didn't ask anyone what to do. I went to the bank alone. Sitting there, signing forms, listening to the soft stamp hit paper, I felt something unfamiliar, authority over my own future. I updated nominees. I reorganized accounts. I asked questions without apologizing. The manager spoke to me with respect, not pity. When I walked out, the sun felt warmer, as if the world had subtly acknowledged my presence again. Around the same time, my son started calling more frequently. I let the phone ring longer now before answering. When I did speak, I kept my voice calm. No complaints, no guilt, no advice unless he asked. That change confused him. I could hear it in his pauses, in the way he searched for the old version of me, the one who rushed to fix everything. "She's been under a lot of stress," he said once carefully. "I understand," I replied simply. And I meant it. Understanding no longer required self-sacrifice. Then came the first crack in their image of control. My son asked, almost casually, if I still had those papers related to the house. His tone was light, but his intention was. I told him the truth calmly. "Everything is organized, don't worry." He didn't push further, but I felt the balance tilt. People began treating me differently too. Not kinder, just more cautious. Silence, it turns out, makes others nervous. When you stop defending yourself, they start wondering why. The neighbor who once whispered now asked politely if I needed anything from the market. I declined with a smile. The real shift happened on an ordinary afternoon. My son's wife called me directly for the first time in months. Her voice was different, still firm but layered with something else, calculation. "We might come by this weekend," she said, not an apology, not a request, a test. "You're welcome," I replied, my tone neutral. When I hung up, my hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. I realized then that whatever power she once held over me had depended entirely on my reaction, and I had taken that away. I cleaned the house slowly, deliberately, not to impress, to prepare. I placed my husband's photo back on the shelf. I laid out documents in a folder, not because I planned to show them, but because I liked knowing exactly where my strength was stored. When they arrived, she looked around, scanning for weakness. She didn't find any. I served tea without rushing. I listened more than I spoke. My son kept glancing at me, as if trying to read a language I had only recently learned myself. They left earlier than expected. That night, I sat alone and understood something essential. Power had shifted the moment I stopped trying to prove my innocence and started honoring my boundaries. I was no longer reacting to their choices. I was becoming a factor they had to consider. And they could feel it. Like anger. It looked like paperwork. It started with another visit to the bank, then to a lawyer whose name my husband had once scribbled in the margin of his diary. I walked into that office without fear. There was no dramatic story to tell, no tears to perform. I simply laid out facts, property, savings, nominees, and a question about protection. The lawyer listened carefully, then nodded. "You've waited long enough," he said. I smiled. I had. Within weeks, everything was official, clean, legal, quiet. I did not tell my son. I did not warn his wife. Revenge does not need an audience when justice is already on its way. The shock came on a Sunday. They arrived unannounced this time. No smiles, no tea requests. My son looked tired, his shoulders heavier than before. She went straight to the point. "We need help," she said, sitting down without waiting for permission. "Financially." I listened, fully, patiently. She spoke of debts, of pressure, of how things hadn't gone as planned. My son avoided my eyes. When she finished, she looked at me with expectation, almost entitlement. I nodded slowly. "I understand," I said. Then I stood up and brought the folder from my room. Their attention sharpened immediately. I placed it on the table and opened it, not dramatically, not angrily. I showed them the truth, the updated documents, the legal decisions, the boundaries now written in ink instead of emotion. The house, the savings, everything I had worked for, it was protected, assigned, untouchable. My son's face drained of color. "Amy, when did you?" When I realized silence was safer than explanation, I replied gently. His wife tried to recover, her voice rising. "So you did this out of spite, to punish us?" I looked at her calmly. "No, I did this to protect myself. If that feels like punishment, perhaps it's because you expected something you were never entitled to." The room fell quiet. For the first time since she had burst into my house months ago, she had nothing to say. My son finally looked at me, not as a provider, not as a resource, but as a person. "We thought," he began, then stopped. "Thought what? That I would always be there to absorb disrespect, that my love came without limits." I closed the folder. "You're adults," I said softly. "You'll find your way, just as I have." They left shortly after. No shouting, no threats, just shock, heavy and undeniable, hanging in the air they took with them. I sat down alone and felt no guilt. Revenge that screams leaves scars. Revenge that teaches leaves lessons. That night my phone buzzed with messages I didn't open. Apologies, explanations, confusion. It didn't matter. The balance had been restored without cruelty, without insults, without a single raised voice. What they had taken for weakness had become my shield. And the shock of it would stay with them far longer than any argument ever could. Time did what arguments never could. After that Sunday, the noise around my life faded. Calls became careful. Visits, rare. The world that once felt entitled to my patience suddenly learned restraint. Moral justice does not rush to announce itself. It waits until everyone understands exactly why it has arrived. My son came alone a month later. He stood at the door longer than necessary, as if rehearsing lines he wasn't sure he deserved to say. When I opened it, he didn't step inside immediately. He looked smaller somehow, not because he had lost power, but because he had finally understood responsibility. "I didn't protect you," he said quietly. I didn't interrupt. Justice needs space to breathe. He spoke slowly, about regret, about pressure, about how easy it had been to let someone else speak for him while he hid behind silence. His voice cracked when he said, "I thought staying quiet would keep peace." I nodded. Silence keeps peace only when it's chosen, not when it's forced. He lowered his head. For the first time, he wasn't asking for money or solutions or forgiveness on demand. He was acknowledging a truth he could no longer escape. I did not rush to comfort him. I poured tea. I sat across from him, not above, not below, equal. That was the real justice, balance restored without revenge, authority without cruelty. She's struggling, he added carefully, but she understands now, boundaries. I believed. Time did what arguments never could. After that Sunday, the noise around my life slowly dissolved. No dramatic apologies echoed through the house, no sudden transformations announced themselves. Instead, there was distance, careful, respectful distance. And in that space, truth settled like dust after chaos. A month later, my son came alone. He stood at the door longer than necessary, his hand raised to knock, then falling back to his side. When I finally opened it, he didn't step in immediately. He looked uncertain, like a child who had once known this place as home and was now unsure of his welcome. "I didn't protect you," he said quietly. I stepped aside and let him enter, not because I owed him comfort, but because justice does not require cruelty. We sat facing each other, the same table between us where threats had once been spoken. The silence this time was different. It was honest. "I thought staying quiet would keep peace," he continued. "I didn't realize I was choosing the wrong side by choosing nothing." I poured tea slowly, letting his words exist without interruption. "Silence only keeps peace," I said, "when it is chosen freely. When it is forced, it becomes betrayal." His eyes filled, but he didn't look away. He spoke of regret, not the shallow kind that begs forgiveness, but the deeper kind that recognizes damage cannot always be undone. He admitted how convenient it had been to let someone else fight his battles, to let me absorb the consequences of his avoidance. For the first time, he wasn't asking for solutions. He was accepting responsibility. That was moral justice. Not punishment, not victory, accountability. "She understands boundaries now," he added carefully. "Things aren't easy between us, but they're clearer." I nodded. Consequences educate faster than lectures ever could. She had mistaken access for ownership, patience for permission, love for weakness. Reality had corrected that misunderstanding without me raising my voice even once. When my son left, he touched my feet before going, not as a ritual, as recognition. Life did not suddenly become perfect after that. Relationships rarely heal in straight lines, but something fundamental had shifted. People spoke to me with care now, not fear, respect. I was no longer the woman expected to bend first, apologize first, give first. And I didn't harden. That was the most important part. Justice did not turn me bitter. It made me balanced. I helped when I wanted to, not when I was pressured. I loved without erasing myself. I spoke when necessary and stayed silent when silence served me, not others. Sometimes, late at night, I sit in the same living room where the door once slammed and shattered glass across the floor. The house feels peaceful now, not because everyone agrees with me, but because I finally agree with myself. Pain taught me where I was vulnerable. Humiliation taught me how easily truth can be twisted. Silence taught me patience. Power taught me boundaries. Shock taught others respect. But moral justice taught me the most important lesson of all. Love does not mean surrender. Motherhood does not mean ownership, by them or over them. And dignity, once reclaimed, does not need permission to exist. I am still a mother, just no longer a target.